Hello, class. This is Socrates and Confucius, part two. We're going to pick up where we left off last time with the errors of Socrates. So, the first guy we're going to talk about is Plato. Who was Plato? Well, he was born to privilege. His family was one of the oldest and wealthiest in the city of Athens. He was also a student of Socrates, as you know. And unlike his teacher, he was a prolific writer. Socrates never really wrote anything. As a matter of fact, almost everything that we know about Socrates came via his students, including people like Plato. Um, Plato authored more than 24 treatises on various subjects. In these, he often attributed major philosophical arguments and teachings to his master, Socrates, so that it is often difficult to know where Socrates' ideas end and Plato's begin. The best example of this is his famous work, The Republic, which is a 10-part treatise, in other words, 10 books or chapters framed as a series of dialogues between Plato's teacher Socrates and other major characters. There are two main themes from the Republic that I want to elaborate on here. The first is what is the meaning of justice? In other words, what does it mean to be a just person? And what does it mean for a society to be just? And the second is something called the theory of form. Um, Plato's theory of form essentially holds that all the sensory objects that we observe and interact with in the world around us are merely imitations of an ideal form, which is kind of like a mathematical equation, like, say, E equals mc squared. Well, they are things that remain true even if we cannot observe or recognize them in our world today. So, for example, a basketball is essentially an imperfect of a sphere. In other words, a perfectly round three-dimensional object. Even if you lose your basketball, or even if all the basketballs in the world cease to exist, such a thing as a sphere would still exist. Similarly, Plato argues that things like love, beauty, justice, mercy, these are all forms. They are ideals that exist, even if the imperfect and perishable versions of them that we can see and interact with in our world cease to exist. Take love, for example. We all experience love in various forms with other people, wives, husbands, girlfriends, boyfriends, and we know that such love is imperfect and perishable because it can end in heartbreak, divorce, breakup, etc. Even if you break up with your boyfriend or girlfriend, that doesn't mean that love itself ceases to exist. Love continues to exist, even when the imperfect and perishable forms of it that we interact with in our world cease to exist. Next, we come to Aristotle. So who was Aristotle? Well, just as Plato was a student of Socrates, Aristotle was a student of Plato. He spent some time at Plato's famous academy in Athens. Like Plato, Aristotle came from a privileged background. His father was actually the personal physician to the king of Macedon, which gave him connections at the Macedonian court, which in turn led to his appointment as the personal tutor to the young crown prince, Alexander the Great. Um, Aristotle made a number of major contributions to the discipline of philosophy. One of them is the syllogism. Aristotle wrote two treatises on the discipline of logic, which is kind of a sub-discipline of philosophy. And in these treatises, he invented the concept of a syllogism. The syllogism is basically a formal way of organizing an argument so as to allow its validity to be examined and challenged. that involve laying down two or more premises from which a specific conclusion can be drawn. A classic example of this is the syllogism, all men are mortal, premise one, I am a man, premise two, and then conclusion, therefore I am mortal. Aristotle also um, came up with a concept very influential in the discipline of ethics, yet another subdiscipline of philosophy, called the golden mean. The golden mean. The basic idea behind the golden mean is that in situations where you face a choice between two extremes of human behavior, the right choice will usually lay somewhere in the middle. So, for example, between living life as a porn star and taking a vow of chastity as a nun, the golden mean might be to choose to live in a committed monogamous relationship with one person. Um, the idea of the golden mean also had applications for politics. Like Plato and Socrates, Aristotle harbored deep reservations about the long-term viability of democracy as a political system. But he also had reservations about Plato's solution in the Republic, which was kind of a rigid caste system dominated by a hereditary elite. In his treatise, titled Politics, Aristotle suggested a compromise of sorts. He suggested that the best possible regime would be something like a mid-sized city-state, not too large to govern, not too small to defend itself, which would be run by a property-owning middle class. He especially liked farmers, with some sort of written framework of government, i.e. a constitution. He also wants public education to teach citizens in order to be better citizens, to teach people in order for them to be better citizens. Uh, that's the golden mean in a nutshell. Now we come to the Eastern parallel, the Confucian answer to the Socratic tradition. And here we have to talk about Confucius. So, who was Confucius? Well, most experts agree that the historical Confucius probably lived between around the years 551 BCE to 479 BCE. We also generally agree that he was born in the state of Lu on the northeastern coast of China. His birth date, if accurate, places his life during the latter stages of the Zhou dynasty. The Zhou dynasty. The Zhou state at this, which at this point was at its highest point, dominated much of what is now northeastern China, and had in turn replaced the Shang dynasty, China's second of the three reunification dynasties. By Confucius's time, however, the Zhou dynasty's greatest years were behind it, and about 70 years after his death, the unity it had brought to much of China would collapse in an era of internecine violence called the Warring States period, during which his empire would unravel and numerous smaller states would end up jockeying for power. Confucius was born into an aristocratic family of the Shi class, which is often translated as knight or retainer class. Families of the Shi class were originally landowners. By Confucius's time, most of them had lost their land and now made a living as officials/servants for various regional rulers and lords. Confucius himself seems to have held a number of mid-level bureaucratic offices in the Lu state, including director of corrections and at one point an accountant at a granary. So he was basically a pencil pusher most of his life. While serving the Lu ruler, Confucius had access to the ruler's library, where he spent many years in quiet study compiling and editing what would eventually come to be regarded as the five classic texts of Confucianism. They include the Book of Changes, part of an emerging literature on fortune telling. It was basically a manual for fortune tellers on how to perform various soothsaying rituals. The Book of History, a collection of historical documents justifying the overthrow of the Shang and the creation of the Zhou state. The first lengthy historical narrative in Chinese history. The Book of Etiquette, which is basically a manual for behavior, proper behavior for members of the noble class. The Book of Songs, a collection of Chinese songs and poems allegedly compiled by Confucius, which explore such timeless themes as love, courtship, farming, and the hardships of war. And lastly, the Spring and Autumn Annals, chronicle of the latter history of the Zhou dynasty from the 8th century BCE to about Confucius's time. Confucius eventually left the service of the Lu ruler after a quarrel over the ruler's womanizing lifestyle, which Confucius regarded as unbecoming of a lord. He spent several years of his life wandering about China, teaching and gathering disciples. Like his Western counterpart and newer contemporary Socrates, Confucius left behind no original writings of his own, although he is usually regarded as the editor slash compiler of the 5 aforementioned classics of the Confucian tradition. But Confucius's numerous students and disciples did compile many of his sayings and anecdotes about his life into a book typically referred to as the Analects, or the Analects of Confucius, which most scholars regard as a generally accurate record of Confucius's thought and teaching. With that in mind, let's talk about some of the teachings. Well, Confucius describes himself to his disciples in the Analects as a mere transmitter, who merely imparted the wisdom that he had curated from ancient texts to his students. Those students, however, clearly thought he had something important to say. Unlike Socrates, who developed a system of philosophical inquiry, i.e., the Socratic method designed to uncover objective truths about the world, Confucianism is fundamentally a practical philosophy designed to teach human beings how to live lives of integrity and propriety, as well as, to some extent, a political philosophy outlining the proper duties between the ruler and the subject, as well as the desirable qualities that rulers should cultivate in themselves. Many of Confucius's teachings focused on the importance of cultivating in yourself certain virtues that would allow you to live a life of integrity, honor, propriety towards others. In the Analects, Confucius refers to such a life as the way or Tao of the gentleman. Gentleman is Junzi, which also is sometimes defined as a ideal or superior person. This meant cultivating 5 virtues that Confucius deemed essential to following this way or Tao. The first is benevolence. Basic idea is that one should always act towards others with consideration of what is in their best interests, not just your own. One of the more famous sayings from Confucius from the Analects is, "What you do not wish done to yourself, do not do to others." This is often described as the Confucian Golden Rule. This does not mean, however, that one should merely do what others wish in order to win their favor, but rather to do what is truly in their best interest. As Confucius himself put it, the man of noble mind seeks to perfect the good in others, and not their evil. The man of small mind seeks the reverse of this. Second virtue, righteousness, or yi, roughly equates to unselfishness or integrity, especially in one's dealings with others, or in the case of a public official, in the discharge of one's public duty. As Confucius put it, a gentleman, quote, thinks of righteousness when faced with pain. The third virtue is ritual propriety, or li, and it basically refers to a person being willing to play his or her role in society well, particularly with an eye towards fulfilling one's traditional obligations in certain customary relationships that most people could expect to participate in during their life. In particular, Confucius identified five, he called them constant relationships that people should emphasize performing well. One was the relationship between a ruler and subject. Second would be the relationship between a parent and a child. The third would be a relationship between a husband and a wife. The fourth would be elder brother and younger brother. And fifth would be elder friend and younger friend. According to Confucius, although each of these relationships entailed a certain degree of hierarchy, they also entailed reciprocal obligations. In other words, all the parties to these relationships owed something to the other. Husbands, for example, were obligated to protect their wives and work hard to provide for them, while wives were obligated to honor and obey their husbands, even if uh, their husbands were not particularly nice to them. Children, likewise, were obligated to provide and care. Parents were obligated to provide and care for their children, raise them, educate them, etc. Children were obligated to obey their parents when young, care for them when old, and mourn for them when they died. Confucius, for example, mourned for his mother for 3 years after his passing, an example which many of his disciples strove to emulate. Also, children would be expected to make sacrifices in the memory of their uh, dead or parents afterwards, after their deaths. It should also be noted that, according to Confucius, family relationships should be governed by an underlying value that he called zhao, or filial piety. For Confucius, possessing zhao meant honoring and reverencing one's family and working hard to fulfill one's obligations towards family members, including caring for children and elders and continuing the family line. The corollary to the Confucian emphasis on ritual propriety is the belief in the importance of ritual and/or tradition. Confucius taught that most of these constant relationships could be performed well if one deliberately followed the rites, rituals, and traditions of one's society. Or, as he put it, do not look, listen, speak, or move unless it is in accordance with the rites. It's important to note, however, that Confucianism does not advocate for ritual for its own sake. To be meaningful, ritual has to be accompanied by the right attitude or state of mind on the part of the person involved in the ritual. As Confucius put it, ritual performed without reverence or mourning without grief, these are things I cannot bear to see. The fourth virtue, wisdom, or ji, involves cultivating the ability to correctly appraise both people and situations and oneself. To Confucius, wisdom meant being able to discern the upright and crooked character traits in others and to act accordingly. One way to do so was to trust and promote those who exhibited upright character traits while being wary of those who exhibited the opposite. At the same time, Confucius also cautioned that wisdom should be tempered in two ways. First, with kindness. How can a person be considered wise if that person does not dwell in benevolence? Second, with humility. True knowledge meant being confident in the things you know, but being willing to admit the things that you don't know. And the final virtue, trustworthiness, is kind of a combination of honesty and reliability. According to Confucius, one is trustworthy. If one is trustworthy, others will give one responsibilities. In other words, if you want to advance in your career or win the trust of others, it's important to say what you mean and do what you say. And while it's important to be trustworthy, it's also important that others know this about you. The value of trustworthiness is a good place to pivot to talking about politics because the important Because while all of the aforementioned virtues were important for rulers and public officials, trustworthiness, or Jin, was by far the most important. According to one story in the Analects, Confucius was once asked what the three things were that a kingdom needed, and he replied, arms, food, and trust. When asked which of these things a kingdom could most afford to lose, he said arms. When asked what it could dispense with next, he said food. The one thing it could not afford to lose, however, was trust of the people in their rulers. For, quote, if the people do not find the ruler trustworthy, the state will not stand. Unquote. In order to win the people's trust, however, it was also important for a ruler to show wisdom. Particularly in promoting good and honest officials to positions of importance in the state. As Confucius put it, place the upright over the crooked, and the crooked will be straightened out. Unquote. And one of the most important virtues to look for in an official was righteousness, particularly when it came to discharging one's duties without regard for personal gain or promotion. According to Confucius, quote, the man of honor thinks of his character, the inferior man of his position. The man of honor desires justice, the inferior man favor. Unquote. Finally, perhaps the most important thing for both rulers and officials to do was to always set a good example for their subjects. Confucius had a strong belief in the power of rulers to alter their subjects' behavior simply by setting a good example to follow. Or as he put it, quote, if a ruler is himself upright, his people will do their duty without orders. But if he himself be not upright, although he may order, he will not obey. Um, lastly, we come to talk about the enduring influence of Confucius. As mentioned above, Confucius himself left behind no original written works of his own. He's kind of like Socrates in that respect. Only compilations he is said to have curated and edited, like the aforementioned 5 classics, as well as a collection of his sayings and teachings recorded by his many disciples, the Analects. Indeed, like Socrates, without Confucius's disciples and the many scholars who studied his teachings after his death, we would know nothing about him. One of his greatest posthumous disciples, who lived roughly 100 years after his death, was the Chinese philosopher Mencius. Mencius took the Confucian traditions and elaborated and expounded upon them, addressing many issues that Confucius himself either did not cover or barely covered. For example, Mencius had a lot to say about human nature, a topic that Confucius did not explicitly address. Mencius taught that human nature was innately good, would be corrupted without positive cultivating influence from one society. To Mencius, the way to cultivate the best in human nature was through education or training of one's mind, or as he put it, quote, he who exerts his mind to the utmost knows his nature. Finally, it's important to note that the Confucian tradition really took root in China during the Han Dynasty. Han rulers liked Confucianism because of its emphasis on uprightness and integrity among government officials, as well as obedience on the part of subjects. And for that reason, they made it the official state philosophy, not to mention the basis of their entire educational system. Ever since then, Confucianism has remained deeply ingrained as a part of Chinese culture.